privilege. Basically, executive privilege, it allows the president and other members of the executive branch to withhold information, even from the other branches of government in an investigation, if the particular communications are considered, a matter of national security or something like that. So we're going to take a look at this article. It's called Biden versus Trump at Heart of January 6th Records Case, Executive Privilege Dispute. So, looking at this article, I'm going to go through and read it, and then I'll put up the questions that you'll need to respond to based on your opinion of this issue. Who decides what presidential documents should remain confidential? That's the fundamental question a three-judge federal appeals panel grappled with Tuesday in former President Donald Trump's case to prevent a House committee from receiving records from his administration. The House panel is investigating what Trump and his aides were doing on January 6 as a violent mob stormed the Capitol. Trump is fighting the release of hundreds of pages of documents, such as call logs of who he spoke with that day and handwritten notes from aides, which he claims fall under executive privilege. But President Joe Biden has waived executive privilege for the documents. What do we do with this dispute between the current and former president? Asked Judge Patricia Millett, who sat on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals panel with Judges Robert Wilkins and Ketanji Brown Jackson. I think this all boils down to who decides, Jackson added. The arguments between lawyers for Trump, the House January 6th committee, and the National Archives and Records Administration, which holds the records, was scheduled for 40 minutes and lasted more than 3.5 hours. U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan rejected Trump's arguments by ruling that Biden's waiver of executive privilege outweighed the opinion of his predecessor. Chutkan also refused to block the committee's access while the case is appealed, but the appeals court postponed the release of the documents while the case is argued. So ultimately, the documents have not yet been released to these other parties. Whatever the decision, the case will set a new framework for congressional access to executive branch documents. The case is urgent because the committee is eager to review the documents as it considers legislation to discourage upheaval surrounding the 2022 and 2024 elections. The House committee made a sweeping request in August for documents from the National Archives and other federal agencies as the panel pieced together what led to the attack on the Capitol and how the White House responded that day. About 140 police officers were injured. Police fatally shot a woman outside the House chamber as the counting of Electoral College votes was temporarily halted, and Pence and others were rushed to safety. One of the thorniest aspects of the case is that it's not about the separation of powers. Biden agrees that Congress deserves the documents. But the dispute is between executives, Trump and Biden. Supreme Court precedent from a case called Nixon versus the General Services Administration holds that the current president's view on executive privilege outweighs a former president. Trump's lawyers argued that it would harm the executive branch if presidents of different parties revealed each other's confidential communications. If there is a disagreement, it is incumbent on the courts to make a decision about whether that privilege exists, says Justin Clark, one of Trump's lawyers. Calling balls and strikes on whether or not a document is privileged or not is really more of a technical analysis than what the archivist and the Biden administration have done here. Millett noted that previous court decisions found that claims of executive privilege weaken over time, but that this case came soon after Trump left office. This one is pretty quickly on the heels of former President Trump leaving office, Millett said. The recency of it has to count for something in the nature of his interests. The first batch of documents, which was scheduled for release November 12th and postponed while the appeals court considers the case, included 39 pages that Trump claimed should remain confidential under executive privilege. The pages include handwritten notes about events on January 6th, appointments for White House visitors, and switchboard checklists showing calls to Trump and Pence, according to a court filing from the National Archives. Another batch of records, which was scheduled for release November 26 and also postponed by the court, included presidential calendars and handwritten notes about January 6th, a draft speech for the Save America March, a handwritten list of potential or scheduled briefings and phone calls concerning election issues, and a draft executive order concerning election integrity, according to the agency. The appeals judges wrestled with what standards courts should use in balancing the competing interests between presidents and between the executive and legislative branches. Millett said Trump's lawyers hadn't detailed objections to the release of specific documents. Your thought is that without any guidance from the former president, without any insights, any declaration, any argument, even from the former president, the court itself is supposed to go through and make arguments the president hasn't about particular documents, Millett said. Jackson said she was concerned about the statute not explaining what standards should be used in balancing the release of documents. That's what has me worried, Jackson said. What is the court supposed to do? Do we start from scratch to determine which president has the right view of this? Do we look at the records? Clark suggested testing whether Congress has a crucial need for the documents, whether the records are available elsewhere, whether they are privileged, and whether the confidentiality can be overcome. The harm here is that constitutional harm to the executive branch, Clark said. Millett said if executive privilege ended with each change of administration, it wouldn't be worth much. Everyone will know the clock is ticking, Millett said. God bless the president who tries to get confidential advice on something imperative on January 19th, the day before the inauguration of a new president. But Brian Boynton, a Justice Department lawyer for the National Archives, said the executive branch takes claim of executive privilege seriously. There's no indication that this administration or prior administrations have willy-nilly disclosed information where there is not a basis to do so, Boynton said. The circumstances in this case are extraordinary. The case deals with the Presidential Records Act, which Congress adopted after the Watergate scandal nearly half a century ago in order to preserve administrative documents. Douglas Letter, the House General Counsel, said under the statute, the Constitution and court precedent that the current president's opinion about executive privilege would outweigh a former president or even 4 former presidents. It would be astonishing for this court to override the current president and Congress, Letter said. Boynton also said it would be extraordinary for the court to overrule Biden's waiver. In no other respect that we are aware of does a former president have the ability to block something the current president wants to do, Boynton said, such as declassifying information, withdraw a state secrets privilege, or an executive agreement. It would extraordinary in all of those circumstances to think that a former president would say, no, you can't do that. Letter argued that if the appeals court rules against Trump, the document should be released immediately. This is interfering with something that is going on right now with immense speed, and that these are key documents, Letter said. They are moving at breakneck speed. Thanksgiving has not slowed us down. Trump's lawyers asked for a 14-day delay in release to allow for a possible appeal. So, lots of information there and lots of things to think about. This is the follow-up questions that I'd like you to answer based on this article. So you've got the definition of executive privilege there. Based on this article, who has the ability to decide which presidential document should remain confidential? The current president or the former presidents? So think about that. What's your opinion? Does Trump even have a say in this? Does it just come down to what the current president says? What do you think? Do you think if these particular documents in question were released, it would weaken the executive privilege of the president and their cabinet in the future? So that was one thing mentioned in the article. Like, what does this mean if the second you don't serve as president anymore, any confidential information can just be released? They're wondering if that will have implications later with executive privilege in the future. So what are your thoughts about that? Make sure to explain your answer. And this situation is specifically unique. So in the article, there is a precedent. A precedent is just where there's like an established pattern for doing things. In Nixon versus the General Services Administration, they actually found that the current president's view on executive privilege outweighs a former president, meaning a current president is able to release information that was initially confidential from a former president. We also have to consider the timing of this case. So this is something where these documents are kind of going for immediate release. It's not something where, hey, this happened 20 years ago and we're trying to get to the bottom of it. This is something where, Trump was president in January and this happened at the beginning of this year and they're immediately trying to pull this information. So for this case in particular, do you think the document should be released to the House January 6th committee? Why or why not? You can go either way with that, just kind of looking for an opinion. So go ahead and answer these 3 questions. Make sure to use complete sentences for your assignment today. And that is all. If you have any questions, let me know. If you need help with anything, please reach out to me and make sure you're staying up with your weekly stuff. If you are having any trouble with that and there's something I can do to help, do let me know.